Good evening and thank you for coming. My name is Patty Katz and I'm the president of Reach Out America. Last election day was a shock to all who were running on the Democratic ticket. Despite many of the Reach Out America members volunteering to do phone banking for the candidates, we witnessed a Republican tsunami that wiped out many of our best local officials. There are still absentee ballots being counted, so we will remain hopeful that in the next week, we could have some well-wanted turnarounds. After 4 years of Trump and working so hard to flip the Senate and elect Biden, Democratic amnesia set in. And although there are many more Democrats than Republicans in Nassau County, the Democrats decided to stay home and watch reruns of Flipper rather than cast their important vote. Whether angry at Biden and the Democrats or the fact that the infrastructure bill didn't get through the House until this Friday, it didn't bode well at all. Already looking ahead to 2022, the Reach Out America Executive Board is looking into many ideas on how we can improve our campaign tactics and strategy methods to get out the vote. Also, we saw a very contentious library election and earlier a very ugly school board election. So our country and more locally our town and villages are so divided right now, it seems almost impossible to find common ground and civility. I certainly hope in the future we can find ways to express the truth, whether a Democrat or Republican, and find some respectful deliberation during a campaign. Well, we have a wonderful speaker today who we are very happy to invite back for the second time. And she will speak for about 20 to 30 minutes and then we will have a Q&A. So when the Q&A comes, you'll see at the bottom, it will say Q&A. Please go there and not the chat and just put your question in and I'll try to get it to as many questions as possible. I might not get to yours and I'm apologizing up front. So I'd like to introduce now Natanya Briendel, and she's a staff attorney at the Pace Women's Justice Center and an adjunct professor at Mercy College, a former prosecutor with the New York City Human Rights Administration and New York City Law Department. She started the Pro Bono Domestic Violence Initiative at the Brooklyn Bar Association Volunteer Lawyers Project. Tanya will speak about the ongoing human rights challenges, violence, and bigotry that immigrants face. So Tanya, thank you for being here. We are so happy that you're back. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty, and thank you for inviting me to come back. It's always a pleasure to speak to this particular group that I have a lot of fond members in. Good evening, everybody. I, as Patty said, am an attorney at something called the Pace Women's Justice Center, which is located in White Plains, New York. And Patty has asked me to speak to the group this evening about the plight of undocumented women and the unaccompanied migrant children that are coming in such record numbers across the border into the United States from Mexico. I'll start out by first telling you what the Pace Women's Justice Center is. We are a legal services office located in White Plains, New York, on the campus of the Pace Law School, funded by grants from the government and private donors. We are a group of approximately 30 attorneys, paralegals, and support staff who work with victims of domestic abuse, sexual assault, and elder abuse, regardless of a person's gender and regardless of a person's legal status in the United States. I'll start out this evening by speaking first about the crisis undocumented women face in this country. And I'll give you two examples that I have experienced in my cases. You should know that I have been at the Pace Women's Justice Center now on and off for almost 20 years, and I've had a variety of jobs while at the center. Currently, I run a program for victims of domestic violence who want to obtain simple divorces. These two women were clients of mine in the recent past, and I've changed their names, obviously, to protect their anonymity. Elena had fled Central America and entered the United States illegally. She landed in Massachusetts somehow, where she met and married her husband, an immigrant who had obtained citizenship. He abused her to the point where she fled down to New York. Somehow she came across our office and sought our legal help. We obtained a divorce for her by filing the case electronically and successfully obtained her a divorce without the need for her ever to have to appear in court. She was referred to an immigration attorney to then obtain permanent status in the United States. She now lives in Westchester with her daughter and her new husband. What was particularly important, as I'll explain to you in a moment, is that she never had to go to court, which is very significant for someone who doesn't have status in this country. The second client was named Janine. She and her daughter fled St. Thomas from an abusive relationship, and they headed to the United States through Mexico. In Mexico, they were kidnapped and assaulted by a gang. They were able to escape, and ultimately they entered the United States at the Mexican border, where they were detained by customs officials and successfully, with the assistance of her pro bono attorney, Janine and her daughter obtained asylum and made their way to New York. I see in the chat someone stated St. Thomas is the United States. Forgive me, I changed the facts a little bit. My geography is not great. My point is the woman came from one of the islands that you would be surprised by. And I was confused when I met with her that she said she had asylum, and then she explained what had happened to her in Mexico. It was surprising to many people when the Haitians fled Haiti and came through Mexico and assembled at the border with the United States. But I remembered Janine and her daughter. And I think that there's this secret understanding that people from the islands come through Mexico. I wasn't surprised by the people from Haiti accumulating at the border. Why do I, as a family attorney, need to know about my client's legal status in the United States? Well, first of all, as we all know, legal status in the United States enables a person to remain in this country without fear of being removed. It enables people to seek employment, education, a driver's license. Oftentimes, my clients have problems beyond that of an abusive partner, and they need help with other things such as obtaining housing, getting a job, getting a driver's license. Oftentimes, my clients need shelter. They fled abusive situations, abusive homes. Unfortunately, domestic violence shelters that receive government funding are not permitted to house victims who do not have status in the United States because the shelter itself may lose its government funding and the entire entity would be jeopardized. Prior to the Trump administration, there was an unwritten law in the court system that if a person, an undocumented individual who took advantage of the court system would not be reported to federal authorities. I had to repeat this countless times to clients over the years who were fearful about enforcing things like orders of protection, orders of custody, orders of financial support, because they were concerned that by going into the court system, they were exposing themselves to deportation. Once Trump came into office, unfortunately, the climate changed. And although, frankly, the judges themselves were very sympathetic to the plight of the people who appeared in front of them, the New York State Court Officers Union did not have that same sympathy, and they were in a position where they would report undocumented individuals to federal authorities. I did not see this happening in the Westchester courts at all, but I did hear horror stories from my colleagues who practiced in the Queens criminal and family courts about individuals finishing their court proceedings, walking out of the courtroom into the public hallway and being detained by ICE. I am happy to report that this is no longer the case in the court system in New York State, although the fear remains among the people that we assist. Patty had forwarded me some questions, which I'm going to try and address during the course of my conversation. One of the questions was, can an abused woman use their situation to request permanent status in the United States? The answer is yes. Women who are abused, once they have entered the United States, that are not documented upon entry, can participate in one of two programs, provided they work with law enforcement to try and seek a judicial determination against the person who harmed them. The first of these visas is called a U visa, and it is available to women who do not have status, who are victims of domestic violence in the United States. The requirement is that these women work with law enforcement, either the police or the prosecutor or a caseworker through the Department of Social Services, sometimes called Child Protective Services, in an effort for the adjudication to go through. It does not mean it has to be successful. It simply means that they have to cooperate with the individuals. We work with our clients because often, as you understand, we have to impress our clients with the need that even though they fled an abusive home, they must remain in touch with law enforcement so that they can demonstrate to law enforcement, they can demonstrate in the future to immigration officials that they have cooperated with law enforcement. The second opportunity available to victims of domestic violence is something called Vawa, under the Vawa federal legislation that Joe Biden helped coordinate. This is an option available when a victim of domestic violence is married to an abusive spouse and the abusive spouse is sponsoring her. No longer is a woman required to remain married to the abusive spouse in an effort to get status in this country. She can divorce the abusive spouse, and provided she petitions for status in this country within 2 years of the divorce, she can obtain status in this country. That's why when I first interview my clients and I have an indication that they may not have been born in this country, I ask them about the status of their ability to stay in this country, and I immediately connect them with an immigration attorney so they can start the immigration process simultaneously with the divorce process. What about domestic violence that occurs before the women come to the United States? I'm sure you're all familiar with the term asylum. Asylum provides safe refuge to people who have come into the United States fleeing persecution from their home countries. To establish an asylum claim in the United States, the applicant must show that they face a well-founded fear of persecution based on at least one of 5 reasons: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, membership in a particular social group. You don't hear gender in that category. The last in that list, the last category, membership in a particular social group, has never been clearly defined. And therefore, again, prior to Trump, that was used to protect women who were fleeing domestic violence, rape, torture, genetic mutilation, genitalia mutilation in their home countries, which Trump, through Jeff Sessions, ended during his tenure as president. Fortunately, President Biden has reinstated it as a valid asylum claim. Gender-based violence, as it is currently defined, is the denial of equal status under the law to women. It is the purposeful lack of protection or refusal of state, police, or judicial authorities to get involved in domestic matters that involve abuse, rape, torture, or other severe harms. The denial of fundamental human rights and freedom to women, and the infliction of severe punishment on women for transgressing fundamentally discriminatory social norms. Oftentimes, people who are victims of domestic violence are involved in relationships with abusers who are very, very traditional male role models. I'm talking about heterogeneous relationships. When the women challenge the male role model, that's when the violence occurs. That is an example of gender-based violence that now gives rise to could give rise to a successful asylum claim in the United States. I'm going to turn next to the unaccompanied migrant children. I have to tell you that I work with adults. Obviously, some of my clients have children, so I work with their children as well. But doing the research on the number of migrant children now being detained at the border or elsewhere is almost impossible to ascertain. I've been trying to prepare these notes with figures and statistics for weeks. Number one, it's fluid because of the influx of people at the border. But number two, I am convinced that this information is not being put out there on the internet because nobody wants to share the information. How are unaccompanied migrant children handled? How are their cases addressed? Children's cases, people under the age of 18, children's cases are heard in family courts. I have never handled any of these cases, but I have many, many colleagues who are actively in the role of working for these children as what's called an attorney for the child. They've shared with me some of the stories of some of their clients. This particular child came from Guatemala. Statistics show that at least 160 women were killed in the first 4 months of 2021. Guatemala has one of the highest rates of violence against women in the world. This particular little girl grew up in rural Guatemala with an abusive father who would hit her and her mother. Because their family farm failed, they fell into poverty and experienced hunger. She stopped attending school and started working when she was 12. She didn't feel safe at home or at work, where she was exploited. She fled Guatemala and left for the United States alone. Honduras, where the second child emigrated from, is a country in which gang violence is widespread. The gang members solicit children, young boys, by forcibly recruiting them and threatening to kill, rape, or displace those who resist or their families. This little boy, age 11, left Honduras and entered the United States at the Mexican border with a slip of paper providing the name and address of an uncle living in Westchester County, New York. He was transported to Children's Village, a residential school located in Westchester, for the purpose of being reunited with this particular uncle. First, why did these kids leave home? Why did these kids run away? The countries they come from are unstable. They experience war, internal conflict, and national disasters. They are some of the poorest countries in the world. In Honduras and Guatemala, the two countries I mentioned, over half the population lives below the national poverty level. In Guatemala, 3 out of 4 people live in poverty. Children flee home because of child abuse and neglect. Violence and crime is rampant, particularly directed at women and children. In March 2019 to March 2020, 18,096 unaccompanied migrant children crossed the border from Mexico into the United States, 18,096 children. In March 2020 to March 2021, that number rose to 47,642 children. This reflects an increase of 163%. Arguably, this increase is a result of the Biden administration replacing the Trump administration. What happens to these kids when they arrive at the US border? Who's responsible for caring for them? Some of them are infants. How do they join family members? My biggest fear when I heard about the large numbers of unaccompanied children and the children being separated from their parents at the border during the Trump administration was human traffickers were just going to go in and pick these kids off. There are protections to prevent this from happening. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's not quite as bad as I feared. Some of you in reading the news may have heard reference to something called the Flores lawsuit. Flores, F-L-O-R-E-S. This was a class action lawsuit brought in 1985 on behalf of Jenny Flores, a 15-year-old girl who came here from El Salvador alone, illegally, and was picked up at the border, placed in a detention facility where she was housed with adults, both men and women, subjected to daily strip searches, was told she would only be released to her parents, who themselves were illegal and therefore wouldn't come get her. A class action lawsuit was filed and an agreement was entered into, a settlement containing terms under which juveniles were to be detained and released properly to suitable caregivers. This lawsuit expanded the ability of parents and other relatives to pursue custody of juveniles, but still, how do you ensure that the proper people come pick up the children? The Flores settlement made it an administrative responsibility to release children from detention without unnecessary delay to a parent or adult relative or licensed juvenile program willing to accept custody, such as Children's Village, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. If the child needs to be detained for a short period of time, the government must provide age-appropriate settings with few restrictions, the ability to contact family, appropriate care for children of that age, including food, water, medical care, and education. However, since 1997, the attorneys have regularly filed lawsuits on behalf of these children to force the federal government to respect the terms of the settlement. We all saw pictures of the cages. That was a lawsuit. The number here, unknown, a lawsuit. Where are the children? A lawsuit. I am on a pro bono attorney email chain, and I get invited every week to take pro bono matters. If I tell you that 90% of the cases are for people who are in this country who need help with their immigration status. One of these attorneys is receiving an award this week because in the last year, she successfully worked with 3 children, just 3 children, to get them properly placed with relatives and out of a detention facility. And this woman is a success story. So how do children get safely released from these shelters to vetted sponsors in the United States? In other words, what safeguards are there in place to ensure that the children do not get released to the wrong people or languish in shelters? Well, there is something called the Special Immigrant Juvenile Status Program, which is an enormous success in New York State. The acronym is SIJS, S-I-J-S. It is handled in the family courts and in the immigration courts on the federal level. This is the way it works. Children come across the border, like in my example, the little boy with the slip of paper in his pocket, indicating he has an uncle in Westchester County. The little boy is transported from the detention center to a residential school in Westchester County. His case is brought to the family court. He never goes to court. Children don't go to court. He's just a little boy. He is appointed a lawyer to represent what he wants, the attorney for the child. The attorney for the child communicates with the judge that this little boy has a piece of paper in his pocket explaining that he would like to go to his Uncle Tim in White Plains. Well, no one knows Uncle Tim. No one knows if Uncle Tim is dead or alive or what kind of person he is. So the attorney for the child is joined at that point by an attorney for Uncle Tim, all appointed by the court free of charge, and the child communicates where his parents are in the home country. An attorney is appointed to represent the parents. The three attorneys communicate with each other. An evaluation is done of Uncle Tim's home to make sure it's a suitable location for the child. Once all of that is done, the judge is informed, the transfer of the child to the uncle is approved, and the little boy goes to his uncle's home. So there's safeguards and guarantees every step of the way. The child is represented. The parents at home are represented. The uncle is represented. An investigation is done. Once the judge is comfortable, the judge issues either a guardianship order or a custody order of the child to the relative. Once that relative has this family court order of custody or guardianship, that relative then, with the assistance of another court-appointed attorney, goes to federal court, to immigration court, and sponsors the child for special immigrant juvenile status. That's how the program works. Who's entitled to pursue this? Although children are under the age of 18, CIG's children are under the age of 21, so they get an additional 3 years. They cannot be married. The family court, as I said, must determine that reunification with one or both of the parents is not capable of being accomplished because they're in the home country where it's dangerous, or the parents are abusive or neglectful, and it is not in the child's best interest to return to his or her home country. What are these benefits to the child? The following requirements are waived to these children. They don't have to lawfully enter the United States. They don't have to decline the need for public benefits. Oftentimes when applying for, always when you apply for status in this country, you have to decline the need for public benefits. The children don't have to do that. They will also forgive certain immigration violations, such as crossing the border illegally. In the beginning of this year, February 2021 to now, Border Patrol intercepted more than 2,000 children traveling without adults, most of them in their teens, but some as young as 6. The vast majority of them arrived from Central America. We were in the midst of COVID at that point. The children were placed immediately in COVID quarantine for 10 days and then transported to shelters around the country. The shelters are better than the border facilities, but still, the Flores lawsuit says get the children out as quickly as possible. As of September 2021, more than 21,000 children were living in these shelters under government care. The shelters were about 80% full at that point. So they're trying, but they can't possibly keep up with the wave of children entering this country regularly. In conclusion, how can you help? Well, I'm up in Westchester, which is truly not so far away. But in Nassau County, there's something called the Safe Center in Bethpage. It is an excellent organization, very similar to the Pace Women's Justice Center where I work, that assists women and children, victims of domestic violence, and people who have problems with their immigration status. If you are interested in working on immigration on a more global level, tell Congress to pass the Central American Women and Protection Act. Write to your legislator. This bill authorizes the Department of State to enter into bilateral agreements with the governments of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to assist these countries in addressing violence against women and children. Call your representative. Tell the representative the US government should ensure that the best interest of the child standard is adhered to for unaccompanied children in immigration proceedings, as it is adhered to for American children in court proceedings. Tell your representative that all unaccompanied children in immigration proceedings should have attorneys. There's currently a bill before the New York State legislature enforcing that, but we need it on a federal level. The United States government should adopt more of a humanitarian approach that recognizes particularly unaccompanied children's emotional needs. The United States government should establish a senior position in the White House to ensure that unaccompanied children's needs are met. And lastly, if you're interested, I obtained all of that information from an excellent website with the acronym KIND, K-I-N-D, Kids in Need of Defense. Now, I have prepared a PowerPoint, which I am happy to circulate to Patty if she would like to circulate it with this information, but that's it for my presentation. And if you have questions, I will try and answer them.
Tanya, thank you so much. We really appreciate all the research that you did and the time you took to present this. Yeah, it's really upsetting. I just have some questions about what you mentioned, like the boy that went to Westchester. How long was that process? Like from getting him here and then finding his uncle and doing all the research and making sure it was safe and then getting him to become an American,
Well, he doesn't become an American citizen. He gets temporary status. It takes a few months. It takes a few months.
So it's a few months, it's not years.
No.
Oh, thank goodness. Okay, that's very good. So if anyone has any questions, go below to the Q&A. I see there's one here. It's from Nina. If the conditions in the home country are so dangerous, how can the parents get an attorney to represent them?
The courts appoint a free attorney from a panel of attorneys, and they communicate with the parents by cell phone or Zoom in this case, or sometimes, or whatever platform people now use. But the attorneys are free.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay.
It's to ensure that the parents, I'm not saying an 11-year-old's gonna, pull a fast one, but it's to ensure that the parents are on board with what the child is doing. Some of these kids are runaways.
Runaways, right, absolutely. So the other thing was, so it sounds like from what you're saying is that from the Trump administration over to the Biden administration, many things were returned that were safeguards for these children. And so Biden's actually doing a pretty good job in that department. But there's still, with 21,000, you mentioned 21,000 kids that are still in these way station houses, wherever they're staying, that's so many. And you mentioned that other lawyer that she was very successful with 3 in 1 year. So, I mean, are there abundance of lawyers working on these cases or is it just a handful and this is going to take years and years and years?
I don't know how many lawyers are working on this. I'm very fond of this one particular organization. I work for a legal services office, so I'm dedicated to pro bono representation, but unfortunately, many attorneys are not. So There used to be a requirement in New York State. It was recently rescinded that before a law student could become an attorney, they had to put 50 hours in of pro bono work. And I believe that's been rescinded, which is a shame because I think there's a lot of value to pro bono work.
Yeah. Well, listen, I'm sure we all applaud all of your work because that's, that's fantastic that you do that.
Thank you.
And this story, all of these stories are just so heart-wrenching that, it's wonderful if there are more people like you that could lend their hand and help these kids and the parents, find safety in our country. It's just such a shock to know that there's so many countries out there that are, where the women, especially women and children, are having such dire, problems. And if anyone else in our attendees, do you have any questions for Tanya? Please write them now. Okay.
Oh, Nina wanted to ask. Yeah, they're American attorneys.
Sorry.
Well, an attorney has to be licensed in the state in which the court exists. So in this case, these are attorneys who are licensed to represent people in New York State, and some of them are bilingual. If not, you get an interpreter service to speak with the parents and the relatives. Sometimes there are a lot of people in this country who don't speak English.
Since COVID, I know you mentioned that there's some COVID. Have there been a lot of changes in immigration as far as, like, have they been turning away a lot of these children, or they're still bringing them in, but as you said, getting them tested, putting them in quarantine, and so they're still coming in, or they're, have we seen that they're, there's a slowdown because of COVID?
Okay, the children are still coming in. To my knowledge, and I would have to check on this, you can turn an adult away because they're adults. You can say, go back to Mexico. Children are minors. And that's why I mentioned at the end that we want we call your representative and say you want these children to be treated best interests of the child like an American child. That's the key language to anyone who practices with children. Best interests of the child. It comes from you think of the situation purely from the eyes of the child. And so, a child, you got a little one at the border who's hungry and tired and hot and dirty. You've got to house this child. You can't just send them back. There are COVID restrictions. So you couldn't give a vaccine to a child who was between the ages of 5 and 11 until, what was it, earlier this week? So these children had to be quarantined, carefully attended to, educated, and transported to where they could be safely sent off to relatives.
Thank you. Let's see, Joan asked, how are the Dreamers being treated now?
Great question. To my knowledge, DACA is open again. I am not sure what the status of it is right now, but I do know that our clients who are DACA, we are telling them to re-enroll immediately. I don't think this will be in jeopardy under the Biden administration. Clearly under Trump it was.
Do you think there's going to be some hesitation because there's talk that Trump might run again? That people be afraid to sign up?
No, I think they'll hurry to sign up. DACA, the DACA kids are different because they may have been born elsewhere, but they're very Americanized for the most part. And they think like an American teenager or American young person. And no, they're not, the ones I've met are not concerned that way, no.
Okay, good. Let's see, Sandra asked, if the immigrant child has no sponsor or relative here in the US, what happens to them?
Good question. I would imagine that child would be freed for adoption.
Ina Lipkowitz asked, what qualifies as domestic violence and how is it reported, especially in countries other than the United States?
What qualifies as domestic violence? It's interesting. For purposes of this lecture, I said domestic violence. I typically say domestic abuse because I think domestic abuse encompasses more than physical violence. Domestic abuse covers physical violence, sexual assault, emotional assault, financial assault. Domestic violence, that would be in this country. Outside of this country, forced marriage. mutilating genitalia, trafficking, sex slaves, body disfigurement, particularly of young children, so that when they beg, they're more endearing, they get more money. I would consider that to be,
That's abuse.
that's abuse.
That's abuse. Thank you. Okay, we have this anonymous attendee. If a child runs away and doesn't have an uncle to house him, what happens? So
If a child runs away, okay, there's a town near me called Portchester, where there are an awful lot of these children. And the school system is wonderful because the school system gives them free breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I don't know where the children live. They make do. They try and stay, off the radar. I don't know how they manage to go to school, but I guess they know that's where they get food. But they're afraid of being found because they think if they're found, they'll be either deported or forced into situations that they're uncomfortable with. That's where there are runaway shelters. A lot of runaway children become victims of sex trafficking. The lucky ones, I've been told by the school system in Portchester, there's a group of teenage boys and they're okay. I guess they band together. I don't know. That's a good question. If kids are going to school, doesn't social services step in? That's an excellent question. If the kids are going to school and the school is fearful that the children aren't properly being cared for, they are mandated by law to report this to social services. Nina is correct. I don't know what's going on in Portchester. They're not my client. All I know is that there is a huge undocumented population of children there, and nobody wants to turn them in.
It's remarkable that in 2021 we're having so many of these issues, and certainly we're not going to be able to fix it right now, but I really appreciate everything that you've done, and we would love if you would send us those actions, your ideas. If you would put down, like, tell Congress, if you just send that to me, because we will look at doing an action for our members that we could send out to our, to the Congress, our members, to support that, because it sounds really important, and we would love to do that. Thank you again for being here with us. We really appreciate it. Everyone, thank you for being here tonight. Just want to remind you for next month, December 8th is our next meeting, and it's at 7 p.m. as well. And we're going to have our guest is going to be Christine Quinn. So we're very happy to be having her join us. So please join us next month. And thank you again, Tanya, for being here, and have
My pleasure.
everybody have good holidays and a very happy Thanksgiving, and be well. Thank you.